It is just after 2 in the morning on July 18th, 2026, out in the eastern desert of Jordan, and the sky over Muwafaq Salti Air Base is on fire. NASA's satellite sensors are picking up heat signatures from the ground. Video is already leaking out, shot from the living quarters, showing the exact moment a missile slams into Earth near where American troops sleep. Sirens, shouting. Service members scrambling for bunkers they have scrambled for before, because this is not the first time this month that alarm has sounded. By the time the smoke clears, 2 American service members are dead. A third is missing. 4 more are being loaded onto medevac flights to Jordanian hospitals. And a war that Washington had hoped was cooling down has just produced its first American combat fatalities since a ceasefire fell apart. Say that plainly because it deserves to be said plainly. 2 people who put on the uniform of the United States military, who woke up that morning at a base 80 kilometers outside Amman, who ate breakfast and checked in with their units and went about the business of defending American interests in one of the most combustible regions on the planet, did not come home. Within hours, the Pentagon would begin the process of telling families. A 19-year-old private from Carrollton, Texas, a 25-year-old first lieutenant from Ewa Beach, Hawaii. Names that, a day earlier, belonged to nobody outside their units and their families. By Monday, the whole country would know them. Here is the detail that almost gets lost in the noise of a single dramatic night of missile footage, and without it, you are not actually watching the right story. This was not an isolated strike. This was the 4th attack on American forces in Jordan in 5 days. 4 separate, escalating, deliberately sequenced attacks on United States military personnel on Jordanian soil. Each one bigger than the last, each one carrying its own message, and the 4th one is the one that killed Americans. Once you understand that sequence, the entire picture changes. You're no longer looking at a single tragic incident. You're looking at the visible endpoint of a calibrated campaign, and to understand why Iran ran it, you first have to understand who actually launched it. Most people carry a fundamentally wrong picture in their heads of the organization behind these strikes, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, and that wrong picture leads people to misread everything Iran does in this conflict. The IRGC is not simply Iran's army. It is not a branch of the conventional Iranian armed forces the way most viewers assume. It is a parallel military structure, built from scratch after the 1979 revolution, with a single founding purpose, not to defend the Iranian state or its people in the ordinary sense, but to defend the revolution itself, the ideology and religious political order the regime is built on. Ayatollah Khomeini did not trust the existing Iranian army to do that job. That army had been trained under the Shah, its officers educated in the West, its loyalty to the new regime uncertain at best. So Khomeini built an entirely new force, one where ideological commitment to the revolution was the price of admission. You do not join the IRGC the way you join a national military. You join it the way you join a cause. That origin shapes everything about how the organization plans and fights. It does weigh capabilities against objectives the way any military does, but layered on top of conventional strategic calculation is a martyrdom culture and an ideological commitment that does not always follow Western logic of cost and restraint. Inside the IRGC sits the Quds Force, its external operations arm, the branch responsible for Iran's sprawling regional network of proxies and partners, Hezbollah in Lebanon, Shia militias in Iraq, the Houthis in Yemen, and directly affiliated units that have targeted American troops across multiple theaters for years. This is not new behavior from a new actor. This is a decades-old institution with American blood already on its hands, going back to the roadside bombs and explosively formed penetrators that killed hundreds of American troops in Iraq, going back to drone attacks on U.S. bases, going back to the January 2024 strike on Tower 22 in Jordan that killed 3 American soldiers. On July 17, 2026, the IRGC added more names to a list that should never have existed in the first place. Now the question worth asking is why Jordan, and why this particular base? Muwafaq Salti, sometimes called MCB, sits out in the desert near Azraq, roughly 80 kilometers from Amman, and it has quietly hosted American air operations for about a decade. It has been home to U.S. Air Force F-15E Strike Eagles and F-16s. During the stretch of the conflict, U.S. Navy EA-18G Growlers, the electronic warfare aircraft that jam enemy radar and communications, were also flying out of it. That is not a support base sitting quietly in the background. It is a mission-critical node feeding the American air campaign against Iranian defenses. During the earlier phase of fighting between Israel and Iran, forces operating in and around this base helped intercept Iranian ballistic missiles threatening Israeli airspace, and Iranian officials noticed. A member of Iran's parliament publicly threatened the base by name in the days before these attacks began. This was not a target of convenience. Iran told the world what it intended to hit, and then it hit it. Why did the pressure concentrate here specifically? As the war escalated, the United States found itself juggling a complicated basing map across the Gulf. Bases in Bahrain absorbed repeated strikes, complicated by the political sensitivity of the country's Shia majority population. Hosts in the UAE and Qatar came under growing strain as Iranian retaliation reached further into their territory. The practical result was a gradual westward consolidation, American forces leaning more heavily on Jordan, a government that has stayed committed to its partnership with Washington, even as that partnership grows more costly by the week. Jordan became, almost by default, the most important remaining platform for American air operations across Iran, Iraq, and Syria. And when an adversary concentrates its assets in one place, that place becomes the priority target. Hitting Muwaffaq Salti again and again was never only about the runway. It was an attempt to make hosting American forces politically and physically too expensive for Jordan's government to keep absorbing. Strike it enough times, and the last stable major American staging ground in the theater starts to look less stable. Walk through the 4 attacks in order, because the sequence is where the intent becomes visible. The first strike hit a residential facility at King Faisal Air Base in southern Jordan, wounding 5 American service members. Sit with that for a second, because it is easy to read past. A residential facility is where troops sleep, the billeting area, the place where people are off duty and resting, not standing at a weapon system or behind hardened defenses. You do not hit a residential building by accident. You hit it because you know exactly what it is, and you want to wound people where they are supposed to be safest. The message of the first strike was precise. We know where you rest, and we can reach you there. The second attack struck an eastern Jordanian base housing UH-60 Black Hawk helicopters, damaging a significant number of them. The Black Hawk is not a frontline strike aircraft, but it is the backbone of logistics, medevac, and special operations support across the theater. Taking a meaningful number of them out of service in a single strike is a real operational setback, not a symbolic gesture. The message shifted from people to equipment. We can hit your personnel, and we can hit your hardware, in whichever order we choose. The third attack came 2 days later back at Muwaffaq Salti itself. Roughly 20 American troops were injured, scrambling for bunkers as ballistic missiles came in. The critical phrase in the reporting afterward was that they were caught scrambling for bunkers, meaning they had warning, they heard the alarm, they were moving exactly as trained, and they still got hit. That is the most psychologically pointed message of the 3. Your early warning system is not enough, your reaction time is not enough, you're not safe even when you do everything right. Then came July 17th, 2026, the 4th attack in 5 days, the 3rd strike specifically on Muwaffaq Salti. Iranian ballistic missiles and one-way attack drones came down on a base that had already been hit twice. 2 American service members were killed, a 3rd was missing. 4 more were medically evacuated to Jordanian hospitals. Fires burned near the runway, visible from orbit. U.S. Central Command confirmed casualties at a base holding one of the densest concentrations of American tactical aircraft in the region. 4 attacks, 5 days, each larger and more lethal than the one before it. That is not chaos. That is a deliberate, disciplined pressure campaign, and it produced the first American combat deaths since hostilities had resumed, pushing the confirmed U.S. military death toll in this war into the double digits and climbing. CENTCOM's statement, released the following day, deserves to be read closely. On July 17th, 2 U.S. service members in Jordan were killed in action as Central Command, and partner forces defended against Iranian ballistic missile and drone attacks, with a 3rd listed as missing in action. Notice the framing. Not on offense, not on patrol, not flying a strike mission. They were defending. That distinction carried weight both legally and strategically, and CENTCOM chose its words with that in mind. The Pentagon would go on to identify the 2 confirmed dead as First Lieutenant Tyler Feehan, 25, of Ewa Beach, Hawaii, assigned to an Army Air and Missile Defense Command out of Fort Bragg, and Private Isabella Gonzalez, 19, of Carrollton, Texas, assigned to an Air and Missile Defense Command based in Germany. Over the following days, search crews recovered unidentified remains at the strike site while efforts continued to determine whether they belonged to the missing service member, and a 4th soldier was killed separately in northern Iraq during a controlled detonation of unexploded ordnance from a downed Iranian drone. Secretary of War Pete Hegseth wrote simply, "Godspeed, heroes." President Trump asked about the deaths, called them very sad, adding that the country hates to see it happen, but that it happened in service to the nation. Here is where the story shifts into something the war had not fully seen before. Within 24 hours of the Jordan deaths, U.S. Central Command launched its 8th consecutive night of strikes against Iran, ordered by President Trump, running roughly 5.5 hours. What matters is not how long it lasted. What matters is the language CENTCOM used to describe it. The statement said the strikes were designed to further degrade Iran's ability to threaten shipping through the Strait of Hormuz and to swiftly punish the specific Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps forces that had launched the attacks on American troops in Jordan. Punish. Not degrade, not reduce, not weaken over time, punish. And not Iranian forces in general, but the specific units responsible for the Jordan strikes. That is CENTCOM saying, in public, that it had identified which units carried out the attack and struck them directly within a day. There's a meaningful difference between two kinds of military logic here. One is capability degradation, hitting radar systems, missile depots, command nodes, production infrastructure, grinding down an adversary's capacity over time. That logic is forward-looking and strategic, and it describes most of the first 7 nights of the American air campaign, hammering Iran's coastal defenses, drone infrastructure, and surveillance systems. The second logic is punishment. Identify the specific unit that committed a specific act, locate it, and strike it in direct response with the goal of deterrence rather than attrition. The message to every other IRGC commander in the theater becomes unmistakable. This is what happens, not eventually, within hours. Pairing those two logics explicitly in the same public statement echoes the doctrine behind the January 2020 strike that killed Qasem Soleimani. According to CENTCOM, the 8th night's targets included Iranian coastal surveillance and air defense sites, maritime capability, missile and drone storage, and the specific IRGC units tied to the Jordan attacks. The Times of Israel confirmed strikes near Iranian territory in the south, and Iranian state media reported hits in central and southern provinces. CENTCOM closed its statement with a line that most coverage treated as boilerplate, but that is worth pausing on. More than 50,000 American service members remain deployed across the Middle East, highly vigilant, focused, lethal, and ready. Put that number in context. The pre-war American presence in the Gulf involved rotating carrier strike groups, a few thousand Air Force personnel spread across regional bases, and Army and Special Operations elements running training and counterterrorism missions. That is peacetime posture. 50,000 troops is a footprint that looks far closer to a major, sustained combat operation, multiple carrier strike groups, the full tactical aircraft presence, additional Army units brought in for base defense and logistics, and the intelligence and reconnaissance backbone required to run a weeks-long precision air campaign from B-2 bombers to F-22s to maritime drones. When CENTCOM says those 50,000 people are ready, that line is not written for the American public. It is written for Tehran. Washington's political temperature matched the operational tempo. Senator Tom Cotton said the president was right to, in his words, unleash hell on their killers, and that further strikes would protect Americans and weaken Iran's grip on the strait. Secretary Hegseth said the sacrifice of the fallen only stiffened American resolve. These were not carefully hedged diplomatic statements leaving room to walk anything back. They were public pre-commitments, and that matters, because as of late July, both sides were locked into exactly that dynamic. Iran's acting supreme leadership spoke publicly of unforgettable lessons still to come, and Iranian officials pledged to answer every American strike with escalation of their own. Analysts tracking the conflict reported that IRGC units were already probing additional targets in Jordan and the wider region, even as the 8th night of American strikes was underway. That is the textbook shape of a pre-committed escalation spiral, the mechanism by which conflicts grow past what either side originally intended. Not because anyone deliberately chose a wider war, but because backing down now reads as losing, domestically and strategically, for both governments at once. Iran's own claims after that 8th night deserve honest scrutiny, because the IRGC's information operation consistently runs ahead of what can actually be verified. Iranian state media and IRGC statements claimed simultaneous strikes on American infrastructure across multiple countries. Missile depots and fuel storage at another Jordanian base, a helicopter maintenance facility, an electronic warfare aircraft hangar, a drone command center in Bahrain, fuel depots and a Patriot battery in Kuwait, and a radar system in Kuwait that Iranian media claimed was fully disabled. Jordan's own military has consistently reported high interception rates and comparatively limited confirmed damage. Independent satellite analysis has shown real damage at some sites, while falling well short of Iran's more sweeping claims. The honest answer sits somewhere between the two governments' competing accounts, as it almost always does in a war like this one. What is confirmed? Sustained, real damage to American basing infrastructure in Jordan, and the deaths of American service members. What remains contested, the full extent of the equipment losses Iran claims to have inflicted. There's a political layer to this that explains why Iran chose a pressure campaign rather than a single decisive strike. Jordan's government faces a genuinely difficult domestic balancing act. A substantial share of the population holds strong Palestinian sympathies and views American military operations in the region through that lens, and Iranian messaging has worked to inflame exactly that sentiment. In the days before the attacks began, an Iranian parliamentarian posted publicly, in more than one language, urging Jordanian citizens to seize Muwafaq Salti and take American soldiers captive, not after the strikes, before them. That is not incidental rhetoric. It is a deliberate attempt to combine physical attacks with pressure on Jordan's internal politics. The theory being that if hosting American forces starts to cost the Jordanian government more at home than it is worth strategically, Jordan becomes an untenable platform without Iran ever having to destroy it outright. Washington understood that dynamic clearly enough that its punishment doctrine messaging after the Jordan deaths was aimed at two audiences at once. Tehran and Amman signaling that attacks on Jordanian-hosted American forces would be answered immediately and specifically, and that the United States considered the partnership worth the cost. The fate of the missing service member hung over everything in the days that followed. Search and recovery teams worked the strike site, while CENTCOM confirmed the recovery of unidentified remains, still undergoing identification to determine whether they belonged to the missing soldier. That uncertainty was its own kind of pressure point, distinct from confirmed combat deaths, because an American service member unaccounted for carries a different political weight, one that could shift the administration's calculus in ways that additional confirmed fatalities, as grim as they already were, had not. By the days that followed, the confirmed toll from the Jordan attack and its immediate aftermath had climbed to 3 killed, with 1 still being identified, plus a 4th soldier killed separately in Iraq, pushing the overall American death toll in the broader war into the high teens and rising, alongside hundreds of wounded since the fighting resumed. Defense officials would later testify that the financial cost of the war had already climbed into the tens of billions of dollars, with even that figure understated because it excluded the cost of rebuilding damaged American bases. What comes next hinges on a small number of variables, and they are worth watching closely rather than waiting to be told about them after the fact. The first is whether targeting the specific IRGC units responsible for the Jordan attacks actually changes the group's behavior. That is the real test of the punishment doctrine CENTCOM laid out. If striking those units directly forces the wider organization to recalculate the cost of continuing to hit American forces, attack frequency should fall. If the IRGC absorbs the losses and keeps pace or escalates, the administration will face a decision about going further, and officials have kept the option of striking Iranian power generation infrastructure on the table without pulling the trigger on it. The second variable is diplomatic. The channel that produced an earlier ceasefire has not formally closed. Pakistan's leadership has reportedly worked to broker renewed contact, and President Trump has indicated Iran reached out about talks, in the deliberately vague language that always accompanies early diplomatic feelers. Both governments remain publicly locked into pre-committed escalation, which makes any climb-down look, on the surface, like weakness. But both retain, at least in theory, the ability to use quiet channels to step back from the ladder without having to say so out loud. None of that changes what already happened at a desert airbase named for a Jordanian pilot killed in combat 60 years earlier. 2 American service members went to work on a Friday in July and did not come home. A third family spent days not knowing whether their child was alive, dead, or missing amid rubble and fire. A 4th soldier died in a different country entirely, defusing the leftover danger of the same war. 50,000 Americans in uniform remain in that theater right now, doing the job they signed up for in one of the most dangerous operational environments the U.S. military has faced in decades, while the White House, the Pentagon, and Tehran all wait to see whose next move breaks the pattern. Whether the missing soldier is found, whether punishment changes Iran's calculus, whether a back channel can hand both sides a way out that does not look like surrender to their own people. Those 3 questions will shape whatever comes next in this war, and they deserve to be followed with the seriousness they demand, because 2 Americans went to a base in the desert and did not come home, and that is not simply a headline. That is the weight everything after it has to carry.